I am currently in Amphibia hell right now. So to make a long story short, around the summer of this year, I began to finally watch Amphibia. And it wasn't until October where I finally finished watching all the show. And if you're already asking me why it took me so long to finish the show, I'm pretty awful about keeping up with shows, even if they have already aired, so yeah, I'm sorry. But it wasn't until my rewatch of the show recently where it just clicked in my head. The show? Pretty freaking good.
Pretty good. Pretty damn good, lads!
So in order to further myself into Amphibia insanity, I decided at the spur of a moment I want to talk about the pre-production history of this show. Cause why not talk about a thing you love for once? And in my research I found a lot of cool things, some stuff that I don't even think a whole lot of people even know about or have even seen. So with my rambling out of the way, let's begin. This is a video talking about the pre-production history of Amphibia. Before we can talk about Amphibia, we need to talk about its creator, Matt Braley. Before working on the show we know and love, Matt interned at Pixar before moving on to DreamWorks as a storyboard artist. He would also do storyboard work for other shows like Steven Universe, Big City Greens, and the movie Mitchells vs. the Machines. But Matt's big break onto the animation scene wouldn't be until 2012's Gravity Falls, where not only would he do the typical storyboarding and design, but he would also be a director of a few episodes, being behind such greats like The Gulf War, Seuss and the Real Girl, and Weirdmageddon 2, Escape from Reality. So if you couldn't already tell, Matt is a pretty talented guy. So it was no brainer for him to get a show of his own sooner or later. After finishing up work on Gravity Falls around 2015 and 2016, Matt would begin brainstorming new ideas for a potential future show. During this process, he would take his own life experiences into account, saying in an interview with Cam, "I got to thinking a lot about my childhood trips to Bangkok, Thailand. My mother is Thai, and every summer she would fly me over, with herself of course, to Bangkok to meet and visit my Thai side of my family. As a California kid, it was really like being transported to a completely different world. It was so different. The culture, the food, the humidity that hits you like a brick wall when you get off the airplane. I remember very distinctly being very uncomfortable at the beginning of these trips. But then like magic, I would slowly but surely fall in love with the place. And then by the end of the trip, I didn't want to leave. So it was that kind of magic, that emotional sensation, that I was looking to bottle up for Amphibia. You got this teenage girl, Anne, who's transported to this crazy frog world, and you better believe she's going to have an uncomfortable time at first. Maybe not love it as much. But then, over the course of the first season, she will slowly but surely fall in love with the place." And this idea verbatim is what many of the characters of Amphibia go through. The girls being transported to Amphibia are very much at a place, but over the course of the series, become much more accustomed to the world and the people that they meet, even creating some truly ironclad friendships that when the time comes for them to separate for good, they all deep down don't want to leave. So it's cool to see that the themes of Matt's experiences perfectly translate over to the final product. We'd also talk about his many inspirations in this interview as well, two major ones being Nick Park, the creator of Waltz and Gromit, and Studio Ghibli, which honestly needs no introduction. I think those two specifically, their films, had such a great balance of warmth and comedy and action. There was this amazing kind of balance that they had, especially Ghibli films. There was excitement, there was imagination, but there was also so much warmth to these characters. I've never specifically thinking to myself, when I watched Totoro or when I watched Kiki's Delivery Service, how helpful all the supporting characters were to the lead. And that was something that I feel like was a little uncommon. I feel that typically in Western storytelling, there was a lot of conflict, and I felt like in those films, there was a lot of support. And these influences, more so on the Ghibli side of things, can clearly be seen throughout Amphibia, like with the floating city of Newtopia being an obvious homage to Laputa Castle in the Sky, and the design of Frobo, which also takes cues from the robots from the exact same film. Going back to Matt's downtime after finishing work on Gravity Falls, he would start creating the cast of characters and world that would be a part of Amphibia. These two pieces are the earliest pieces of concept art we have of Amphibia, and they show off early designs of Anne and Sprig. It's funny to see how the core concept of Anne never really changed throughout the early pre-production phase. Anne still has her pink backpack, her wild bushy hair with leaves in it, her school uniform, and her rugged socks. There's also the other piece of concept art which shows Anne and Sprig decked out with a spear and axe respectively, which is much different from the weapons they usually brandish in the final show, with Anne mostly using a sword and a tennis racket, and Sprig using a slingshot. The only real differences between this Anne design and her final one is that her hair in the concept art is a lot longer and loose, and stretches down to her back compared to her final design, which looks more like an afro and doesn't go beyond her shoulders. Now let's talk about Sprig, whose design is completely different from what he would end up becoming. While his main colors are the same, that's basically about it. Sprig's head and mouth shape are different, his pupils are way bigger, he also wears a bandana, and his clothes are different as well. It's clear that in this phase of development, the frogs were going to be a lot closer to what actual frogs look like, instead of the stylized take the show went with in the end. Both these pieces of concept art were shared by Matt himself on his Twitter page on August 1st of 2022, and as he states himself, were made sometime in early 2015. I should also mention the different title for the show. Throughout a lot of Amphibia's early development, it primarily went by the name of Amphibiland. This name would stick for a long time, long enough that even the pilot would use it, but we'll talk about the actual pilot itself later. Now let's take a look at some more concept art. These next few pieces were done by an artist known as James Turner, and while his name may not be extremely familiar, the projects he's worked on over the course of his career are anything but that. James is mostly well known for his contributions to the enormous Pokemon franchise. He's designed tons of Pokemon, from Generation 5 up until Generation 8. These include such Pokemon like Vanillite, Trevenant, Buzzwole, Obstagoon, among many others. He also worked on other projects at Game Freak, the studio that makes the mainline Pokemon games. These include Harmonite and Tempo the Badass Elephant, where he was both the main director and art director on both projects. When it comes to Amphibia, James was only involved in the pre-production phase. In his first piece we get to see both Anne and Sprig, but in this draft he was known as... Yeah, the jokes write themselves. But anyway, looking at Anne we can already see some major changes from her previous appearance. The first being her skin color, which is way lighter than before. Same goes for her hair, being a lighter teal than the original's brown. It also has a different shape, and is tied around the bottom. Her shirt has a lightning bolt instead of her school's name, and her backpack is a lot rounder and is a completely different color. Anne also has moss around her ankles, which the concept art goes on to state that she does this in order to keep her sins protected while working on Hop Hop's farm, which is a neat little detail. There's also this little guy next to Anne. He isn't given a name, but we'll talk about him later. Next we have Weed, who doesn't look all too different from his previous appearance, besides his design being a lot more refined. There's also this cute little sketch of them being adorable together. We get to see more Anne and Weed sketches on the next page. It describes how Weed uses his tongue to grab things, which is pretty reminiscent of the final show. We even get this cute little doodle of him swallowing a gas bug. Moving on, we get to see our first look at an early design for Hop Hop, which looks way younger than he is in the final show, which is probably due to the lack of wrinkles around his neck, and other areas like his final design has. His clothing is also different here too, with his waistcoat being a more subdued green, and having a light green undershirt. He also isn't wearing any pants, and his bushy ear hair is a slightly different shape than in the final. James also writes a funny blurb about his ear hair, and how it actually doesn't block out much sound, but he uses it as an excuse for selective deafness. We also get to see Polly's original design as well, which isn't too far off from her final design, with the only major difference being that she has completely different colors. On the next page, we get to take a look at the planter house, and oh my god, this looks so comfy. Not knocking on the final design, which has a really cool tree and log aesthetic, but this house just looks so much more cozier. I also really like the colors, and how when you look at it from a certain angle, it sort of looks like a treasure chest. And lastly, we get to see these cute little doodles of Anne and Weed just chilling out on the pond, and then we see Hop Hop get attacked by tadpoles coming out of the well. Both these areas are in the final show, but of course they look somewhat different. The final pieces of James' concept art are environmental and location concepts. The first one shows off a town known as Lily Paddington, as stated by the image's file name. Lily Paddington was the original name for Wartwood, and it looks much more industrialized than the final Wartwood we get in the show. It's also much more busy looking than in the final show, even having a bunch of toad guards on standby. And look at this one frog, he's trapped in the cage the same. And if you look to the left, you can see a little sneak peek of Leopold, not looking too different than how he does in the final show. Though, there is a chance that it may just be some throwaway design that James made. This second piece shows Sprig exploring a swamp. I don't have much to say here, besides I really like the way this looks. The use of cross-hatching to emphasize darker areas, and also using only 3 colors, just makes this scene pop for me. Our third piece shows off another piece of concept art for swamp areas. I also don't have much to say here, besides that this really gives off Gravity Falls vibes. Like this background was just ripped right out of that show. And for our final piece, we get to see an earlier version of Sasha's Keep, as stated in the image's file name. Now part of me thinks this is actually meant to be a concept for Tote Tower, mostly due to the various design similarities to its final. That being the various spikes and thorns that adorn the tower, and also the bridge, which is also shown off in the concept art. Though the name of the file name also heavily implies that this could be concept art for Sasha's Palace, which makes an appearance in her theme song Takeover. But if that's the case, then the OG design is so much more metal than the final one. Like, just look at the atmosphere of this place. While editing this, I actually forgot to bring up one more piece of concept art that James did. This piece talks about two characters that would have been part of the show, those being a Swoomba and the Willowboots. The Swoomba would have been a mysterious creature that rises from the swamps on a full moon, and then wanders the countryside, singing a sad, mournful song. And the Willowboots, which would have been a group of tribal people that communicated through song and dance. They also would have been very territorial as well. While being cool concepts for characters, they would both be unfortunately scrapped, and wouldn't appear in the final show in any form. And with that, we've gone through all of James's concept art pieces. Many of these were posted to his official Squarespace page, along with him sharing it on his own personal Twitter, which you can find links for in the description down below. Before we move on, I want to talk about Sprig a bit more. As I mentioned before, Sprig went for a lot of design changes, and I want to talk about some of those design concepts right now. These upcoming pieces of concept art were designed by Brandon Wu, a character designer who worked at Disney Television Animation, and also worked as a character designer on Amphibia itself. The first one shows off a more adventurous design for Sprig, along with having a leaf bandana, which would also double as a hat. He also has a toy sword, which again is different from the slingshot he gets in the final show. Out of all the Sprig designs we looked at so far, this one is my personal favorite. The next concept piece has a design that's getting more and more to the final. He's still rocking that leaf cape and leaf hat from the previous iteration, but his colors are slightly more in line with his final design. I also like this design. As like the previous one, it really does lean into the more adventure feel that we're going with his character in these early phases. Now it's time to move on to something I've been dying to talk about, which is the pitch Bible for Amphibiland, which was posted on the Comics and Cartoons board on 4chan back in November. According to one anonymous user, they stated that this came from a college seminar that Matt did while back in Thailand. They never specified when he did this, but it was probably more recently. This pitch Bible goes pretty in depth on not only what the show was originally going to be like, but it also shows off some early designs for characters, including some that were cut from the final release. I'll put an archive link of the thread in the description down below for those who want to check it out themselves. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting with Anne's character description, most of what is stated is pretty similar to what happens in the final show, like her being from Los Angeles and being a part of a trio that caused a lot of pranks in the middle school they were at. Where things start to become different is how they got to Amphibia. As her bio states, after the trio prank a frog-faced girl named Geraldine, all three of them end up being banished to Amphibiland as punishment. Now when reading this for the first time, I thought that I was stating that the school banished them to Amphibiland as punishment, which would be pretty hardcore for a school to do. But as the pitch Bible goes on, that's actually not the case. Besides that one change, the rest of Anne's story is more or less the same. She meets with Sprig, here known as Weed, and they both work together on Hop Hop's farm, just like in the final show. Now Marcy's bio is very interesting, mentioning how her defining quality is her sense of humor, and that she comes from a strict family of academics, which isn't brought up in the final show. But one of the biggest differences in her character is how she's very independent, and how she's slowly drifting away from her friends and plans on going to a completely different high school, but hasn't found the right time to break the news to her friends. This is massively different from one of her main conflicts in the show, in which her father has gotten a new job in a different state, which means that she has to leave her friends behind, leaving her to try and find a way to keep the group together. What Marcy does when she's in Amphibia is also different. In the pitch Bible, she joins a traveling troupe of performers and learns to play the lyre along with her having a book of knock-knock jokes. The bio doesn't even mention the Utopian Royal Guard, which may have not been a thing at this point in the development of the show. The last sentence of her bio, however, is a lot more in line with the final show. With the more time she spends in Amphibia, the less and less she wants to actually go back home. And lastly, let's talk about Marcy's design. Her hair and nose are different, and her overall outfit is a lot more simpler than the final one. She also has a brooch in the shape of a musical note, which goes back into her being a part of a group of performers. Sauce's bio also contains a few interesting details, like how it goes into her living situation and how she was raised by a single father, and even implies that she may have grown up in poverty. While Sauce's parents are mentioned in the final show, we don't get to hear from them or even see them at all. But one major difference from this Sasa and her counterpart in the final show is how when she finds out Marcy's going to a completely different school, her first response is to freak out about it and go on to create the biggest prank in the middle school's history in order to keep the group together. Sasa's general motivation here is essentially one-to-one Marcy's motivation in the final show, which honestly feels very weird to me. The rest of her bio is mostly in the same vein of the final show, with her being a manipulator and taking control of the Toad Army. Sasa's bio also mentions that she dreams of becoming a princess, which is reflected in her design, with her wearing a head chain, having a stereotypical royal hairstyle, and let's not forget her boots. Out of all the characters mentioned in this pitch Bible, Geraldine has to be the most interesting. Her bio says she's actually a frog disguised as a human in exile from Amphibiland, because her family was being hunted down by an evil Toad King, who want to use her powers for evil. These said powers come from her being from a line of witches that can open portals between worlds. During the huge prank that Sasa pulled, she accidentally sent all 3 of the girls to Amphibiland in a fit of rage, and in the aftermath, tries desperately to get them back. If you already can't tell by the details, Geraldine is the living personification of what the Calamity Box would become. With both of them having the ability to transport people to different worlds, and they're also sought out by the main antagonist. Speaking of antagonist, the bio did mention an evil Toad King, which could imply that Grime would have not only been a king, but also probably would have been the main antagonist of the series at this point in development. Alright, let's talk about Weed. Or Sprig. Sprig's backstory is mostly in the same vein as his final one, with him working alongside Hop Hop on the Planter Farm, and him having a taste for adventure to combat his mostly average life. And when he finds Anne, he becomes fascinated with her, and believes that her coming into his life is proof that special things can happen to him. Also, there are these amazing gems. Anne found Weed to be annoying at first. Anne has grown to love Weed, though she would never admit it. Alright, now I know why they changed his name. Now both Hop Hop and Polly's bios don't have too many major differences compared to their final counterparts. It's mostly just minor details, like how Polly is stuck in her bucket, unlike in the final show, where she is seen constantly outside of it. Hop Hop in this version also has a serious case of gout, which inhibits him from helping out in the fields. He also gets entertainment from making Anne's life a living hell, and goes on to describe Anne as having a fug-like body and is a bizarre gift from heaven.
Okay.
Moving on. One surprising thing about Hop Hop in this version is that he once had a human best friend who ended up leaving him behind. Being devastated by this loss, it leads him to be very suspicious of Anne when she first appears on the scene, and warns Weed not to get too close to Anne, at the risk of him going through a very similar situation that Hop Hop went through. He also apparently would have sold the kids into slavery.
Base King!
This next part of the Pitch Bible features characters who are all cut from the show. There's Bump, a toad who would have bullied Sprig, and been the mayor's son. Then there's Lottie, a girl who runs a tadpole orphanage, and who Sprig is madly in love with. But Lottie is completely oblivious. Her character is a bit similar to Ivy from the final show, in that Sprig really likes Ivy, but unlike Lottie, Ivy actually likes Sprig back. And finally we have Henry, a literal living supermarket that sells wares and trinkets from within inside his own mouth. He's also the last of his species, but wants to start a family despite this reality. The next slide lays out the overarching themes that Amphibiland would exude, mainly the ability to choose who you are. Like how Anne starts out being a bully, but over the course of the series, would end up becoming a more selfless hero. We also get this adorable little sketch of Anne defending the frog people from this evil toad bully guy, and this drawing makes me really like the concept of Anne with longer hair. The next slide goes over concepts for episodes that probably would have been used if the show got greenlit. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I will bring attention to the episode titled Pole Dancers. Not because of the episode's description, but the title itself. Like, wow. The next slide goes over Grandpa's farmhouse. The bio describes it as a mysterious old farmhouse that has multiple hidden rooms. So many in fact that Weed has never even seen them all. It even has a cellar that has a lot of hidden passageways, and rumor has it that it might even have hidden passages that lead to a vast underground network. We also get to see where Anne sleeps, which is literally just a storage set the planners use, which is different from the final and where Anne just sleeps in the planner's basement. The one thing that is similar to the final is that the attic is basically Grandpa's study, and is off limits to everyone but Hop Hop himself. Moving on to the next slide, does this guy look familiar? He was shown off in that one piece of concept art earlier in the video. His name is Egbert, and as his bio describes, he is a Tamagotchi-esque toy that whenever Anne is at her lowest point, comes to life and gives her comfort and guidance. He also apparently has a soothing voice, think Morgan Freeman, which that little descriptive tidbit makes me think they actually were going to try and get Morgan Freeman to voice the character, which probably wouldn't have been cheap to do. Now listen to this. Egbert is a voidling, a being from the void which is a dimension between Amphibiland and the real world. Voidlings have no physical form and are desperate for any kind of experience, which is why Egbert is hanging out with Anne, along with trying to track down other voidlings hiding out in Amphibiland and forcing them to return back to their home dimension. It also states that this lore won't be addressed until well into the series. So yeah, pretty wild concept for a character, and while Egbert would be cut from the final draft of the show, the overarching idea of an interdimensional being watching over Anne would be later used for the Guardian in the final show. The next slide describes the general world structure of Amphibiland, which is mostly the same as in the final show, including the land being overrun by deadly monsters and there being a very strict caste system. Moving on, the next slides go over to describe Lily Paddington, the earlier version of Wartwood, which overall has very similar details to the final show, down to being run by a corrupt Toad Mayor, though here he's known as Mayor Fump, instead of the final's Mayor Toadstool. And finally, you get to take a look at what the world will have looked like in Season 1, including an early look at Toad Tower, though here is known as Grimes Tower, and it looks way taller than it does in the actual show. The map also shows off other areas like a Foggy Bog, Bandit's Fortress, Beetle Plains, Lily Paddington, and the Blue Dunes. And that's all the slides that were provided from the 4chan thread. I got a feeling that Matt showed off more slides due to some of the screen caps being cut off and lacking context. I hope one day the full Pitts Bible actually gets officially released, so we can fully see all the ideas that Matt had for this show in the beginning. So after going over all the Pitts Bible materials that are available to us, let's talk about the actual pilot itself. Production of the pilot started around sometime in 2017, and took a total of 2 years to make. It wouldn't be until August 6th of 2020 where the pilot would officially be released online for the public to view. The pilot was directed by Jill Calhoun, an editor and animatic director who's been working in the entertainment industry for over 17 years, working for companies like Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and Walt Disney Animation. The pilot begins with Anne writing in her diary, describing her many adventures in Amphibiland. And if you look closely, you can see Anne is wearing a complete set of shoes, which is different from her final design where she's only wearing one shoe. In the next scene we see another different design for Sprig, whose colors also look very similar to Hop Hop here. He also has a completely different voice actor here. In the pilot he's voiced by Philip Van Orman, mostly well known for being the creator of The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack, and where he also voices the main character of that show. We also get to see an early design of Miss Croaker and her pet spider Archie, though he goes by the name Fluffy here, and looks a lot more terrifying than he does in the final. We also get to see some earlier designs for Sasa and Marcy, including both of them having slightly different skin tones. In the next shot we get to see another different design for the Planner household, which has a lot more windows than it does in the final, and looks like it's completely made of wood, instead of a combination of cobblestone and barkwood like it is in the actual show, though that may be due to the lighting of the scene, which obscures a couple of details. Hop Hop still does have the family initial displayed on the sign, but it says an H instead of a P. Hop Hop's design is actually looking pretty close to what he actually looks like in the show, though his sleeves here are yellow instead of green. We also get to see Toad Tower again, though here it has a second tower instead of just being one full tower like in the final show. Also the decorative spikes are different. Captain Grime literally looks the exact same as he does in the actual show, with the exception of his voice actor, this time being Bill Farmer, who's also the voice actor for Hop Hop here and in the final show. The rest of the pilot is a montage, set to an instrumental version of Rather Be by Cling Bandit, but there are a few details I want to point out here. A few of these sequences would actually be reused in the opening of the final show, like Ant being chased by a bunch of marauders, the scene where Ant and Sprig fight a bunch of mud monsters, and this one scene with them in the temple. And lastly we get the show's title card, which uses the Amphibiland name. I think this is the last time this title will be used in relation to the show in the West. And I say this because in the European Spanish and European Portuguese dubs, they actually use the Amphibiland name. And this won't be the only time this will happen for a Disney animated series, as would actually be the case for 2021's The Ghost and Molly McGee, which during its development was known as The Curse of Molly McGee, and both the same European Spanish and European Portuguese dubs would use that old name. And with that, we are done talking about the Amphibiland Pilot. There are actually a few more things I want to mention before I end the video. After the pilot was finished, it was shown off to Disney Channel executives around 2018, who ended up greenlighting the show alongside Dana Terrace's The Owl House. There was even this cute little picture of Dana and Matt together, celebrating both of their shows being greenlit. However, despite the show passing the greenlight process, the executives were asked Matt to make some changes to the show. This is a common thing in the entertainment industry, where before and after your show gets greenlit, executive and studio heads will still regularly give you notes. These notes can range from simple changes to flat out the most stupidest things I've ever seen. There's a Twitter account called TV Network Notes, and it basically illustrates what I've been saying. Anyway, the things that the Disney execs wanted Matt to change were the fantasy elements, telling him to tone that aspect of the show down because they weren't really interested in that angle of the show anymore. And you want to know why they asked this? Because of Nickelodeon's The Loud House. Apparently when The Loud House premiered, it was very successful for Nickelodeon, and Disney essentially wanted to emulate that kind of success. This was all laid out to us in a Reddit AMA Matt did back in August of 2020. To quote him on this, "The pilot really deserved its own discussion, but the only thing I miss is how grimy and mystical that version of Amphibia seemed. In development, I got explicit notes that the studio was no longer interested in adventure or magic, so we tried to tilt away from that stuff a bit." One Reddit user would speculate that this was because of The Owl House, which I mentioned before was also greenlit around the same time and also takes place in a fantasy setting. But Matt would debunk this, stating, "The Owl House hadn't even been pitched to Disney when they were dealing with this note. It had more to do with the Loud House being successful, ironically. While I can very honestly roast a bunch of Disney executives for making this decision, I still think Amphibia turned out to be a very great show despite those setbacks. After the show received a green light, Matt would go onto his Twitter page to break the news. Quote, "Welcome to Amphibia. It's official. We are making a show about a teen girl stuck in a crazy frog world. Please bear with me as I gush and shill harder than I ever shilled and gushed before. Amphibia is a labor of love that was in development for almost 2 years. Development can be a crazy roller coaster of ups and downs, and I wouldn't be here without the love and support of so many wonderful people." And that is the end of me talking about the pre-production history of Amphibia. Right now I'm going to go off script to say a couple of things about this whole video. So if you don't care, you can leave the video now, but if you do want to hear my thoughts and everything, you can just stay around and just listen. At the time recording this, the video isn't out yet. This is one of the final things I'm going to record, and then I'm going to record a rerun of like a redraft of the intro and like everything. But like, my god, this video was such a pain in the ass to record, because currently right now with my schedule of like work and everything, I don't have a whole lot of free time anymore, at least right now. Like, the only times I can record anything for this script was either early in the morning or at midnight when everyone around me is asleep. And let me tell you, it is not fun to record in a time crunch. Because, you know, I like to record when it's quiet or people are either like asleep or just out of the house, because, you know, I think I just do better and my voice turns out much better when I don't feel like I'm having to like lower everything so that people just don't find out, or people just don't bother me asking me like, oh hey, what are you doing, like, you know, all that stuff. Like the section I'm recording right now, literally literally in about 30 or like an hour, I gotta leave and go somewhere. So like, I'm trying to get this done. Like, I'm finally proud that I got this part of the section out and that I'm basically almost done with the script. I just need to re-record and re-script that intro, and then after that, I'm done with the recording. I can just go straight into the editing, which is, in my opinion, the most fun part of making a video. So yeah, there's my spiel. Like, subscribe, comment, all the YouTube algorithm friendly things. See you later. Bye.